One phone call to the Department of Defense was all it took to end their careers and force a nation to confront a truth it had long ignored. It was supposed to be just another uneventful drive through the back roads of rural Alabama. Major General Camilla Hayes, 47, one of the first black women ever promoted to that rank in the U.S. Army, was en route to Fort Redstone for a classified briefing. No official motorcade, no uniform. Just her behind the wheel of a rental sedan, dressed in jeans, sneakers, and a soft-shell jacket, trying to stay under the radar. She'd made this drive through Ashford County a dozen times before. Quiet towns, faded billboards, gas stations that hadn't changed since the 80s. But on this particular morning, as her secure line flickered with low signal and the deadline for her briefing loomed, she pulled into a place that would soon become the center of a national reckoning. Baker's Quick Stop sat like a relic on the edge of Ashford County. A rusting metal canopy, a squeaky door that never quite closed, and a faded Coca-Cola machine that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. It was the only spot within a 10-mile radius where Camilla Hayes could catch a strong enough signal to complete a secure military call. She pulled into the uneven gravel lot without hesitation, scanning her surroundings the way years of training had conditioned her to. Calm, precise, unassuming, dressed in a worn army green jacket, navy ball cap, and nondescript sneakers, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about her appearance. No stars on her collar, no polished insignia, no visible rank. To anyone watching, she might have been a road-tripping teacher, a social worker, or just another out-of-towner passing through. But the reality was far different. Camilla Hayes wasn't just anyone. She was a 4-star general in the United States Army, and her phone call wasn't casual. It was part of an active, time-sensitive chain of command linked directly to the Pentagon. As she lifted her secure line and began her verification protocol inside the store, Brenda Mullins, owner, cashier, and self-appointed gatekeeper of What's Normal, watched from behind the counter. Brenda, 56, with a rigid jaw and permanently pursed lips, had lived her entire life in Ashford and saw every outsider as a potential threat to her tiny kingdom. But it wasn't just Camilla's unfamiliar face that drew her suspicion. It was her skin tone, the way she stood confidently without apology, and the sleek black government-issued device in her hand. Brenda didn't see a senior military officer. She saw what she wanted to see. A black woman loitering by the pumps, speaking into a strange-looking phone, probably up to no good. Her mind filled in the blanks with years of unchecked bias and imagined threats. Instead of walking out to ask a question or simply letting it go, Brenda quietly picked up the landline next to the scratch-off ticket display and dialed the Ashford Police Department. "Yeah, I got someone real suspicious out here," she whispered, ducking behind a shelf of motor oil. "Black female, acting weird, pacing by a car, talking on a device. Might be drugs, might be worse. You'll better come check it out." She hung up before they could ask for details, content in the belief that she had done her civic duty. Outside, Camilla remained focused on the call, unaware that her presence alone had triggered someone's idea of danger. As her voice transmitted classified updates to Washington, a quiet storm of prejudice and presumption had already begun to gather, one that would soon explode into a public firestorm. And as the dispatcher relayed the call over local radio, 2 officers already bored from a slow morning were about to take a drive they would regret for the rest of their careers. The squad car pulled into the lot with a spray of gravel, lights flashing even though there was no emergency. At least, not yet. Lieutenant Kyle Benton, a broad-shouldered officer in his early 40s with mirrored sunglasses and a chip on his shoulder, stepped out first. Behind him followed Officer Jesse Moore, barely out of the academy, still eager to prove himself and already shaped by the quiet arrogance that passed for culture in the Ashford PD. They didn't approach with caution or respect. They approached like they were entering enemy territory. Benton's hand hovered over his holster as he barked, "Ma'am, we need to see your license and registration." "Now." Camilla Hayes, calm as ever, responded the only way she knew how, with clarity and authority. "I'm General Camilla Hayes, United States Army. I'm on official orders. My identification and federal travel documents are in my wallet." She reached slowly, her movements deliberate, non-threatening, just as she had taught countless cadets in high-pressure situations. But Benton didn't look at the documents for more than a second. He sneered, then scoffed. "General, huh? Right. And I'm the president." Jesse chuckled, playing along like it was all a joke. Without another word, Benton reached for his cuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Camilla blinked, stunned not by fear, but by the sheer absurdity of the moment. "Sir, this is a serious mistake. I'm in contact with the Pentagon right now." But her words were cut short as Jessie grabbed her left wrist, wrenching it back while Benton forced the other behind her. The metal cuffs bit into her skin. Her secure phone, still connected to the Department of Defense, slipped from the hood of the car and hit the pavement with a dull crack. From the other end, military command could be heard calling out, "General Hayes! General Hayes, do you copy?" But neither officer noticed or cared. Benton pushed her against the side of the vehicle, the heat of the sun-baked metal stinging through her jacket. "We don't play games in Ashford," he muttered, while Jessie stood by, proud of their catch. Around them, a small crowd had gathered. Locals, truckers, even Brenda Mullins from inside the store, all watching, some with curiosity, others with amusement. Not a single person stepped forward. Camilla didn't struggle, she didn't scream. Her dignity, however, began to splinter. Not because of the humiliation, but because deep down, she knew this wasn't just about her. This was about every uniform, every medal, every oath she had taken, now dismissed by two men too blind to see past their prejudice. And yet they had no idea that the call still open on that cracked phone was about to turn this parking lot into the most regrettable location in their careers. Because back in DC, alarms were sounding, identities were being confirmed, and the cavalry was already en route. In a secure operations center deep inside the Pentagon, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Monroe sat at a bank of monitors, reviewing active communications when a flashing alert drew his attention to an encrypted call line. Labeled Gen Hayes Secure, the feed should have been crystal clear. Instead, it was filled with static, scuffling sounds, garbled voices, and what unmistakably sounded like shouting, followed by a sudden drop in audio. Monroe leaned in, furrowing his brow. "General Hayes, this is command. Do you read?" No response. A moment later, a technician flagged him down. "Sir, the line's still active, but the GPS shows she's off route. She's not at Fort Redstone. She's parked off Highway 92 in Ashford County. Looks like a gas station." Monroe's gut clenched. That wasn't on the approved travel corridor. He didn't hesitate. Ping her last known coordinates. Elevate to red status. Within seconds, the room shifted from routine to urgent. Colonel Dana Whitmore, head of the Joint Intelligence Response Division, strode in, already reading the developing log on a tablet. "What's the situation?" Monroe turned to her. "Possible detainment or interference during classified operations. We're initiating a Tier 1 response." Whitmore didn't blink. "Scramble the Fort Redstone QRF, full escort, and get me Barksdale Air Command on a backup line." Moments later, a secure flash message was sent. "Activate Quick Reaction Force. General Hayes may be unlawfully detained. Immediate extraction authorized." That message, like a spark to dry timber, ignited the machinery of military response. At Fort Redstone, just 30 minutes from Ashford, a convoy of blacked-out SUVs roared to life. Their destination: Baker's Quick Stop. Back at the gas station, Camilla Hayes sat on the curb in handcuffs, the midday sun beating down on her shoulders. Officer Benton paced behind her, trying to look confident, but already second-guessing his actions. Moore stood near the patrol car, arms crossed, feigning authority, but noticeably twitchier now. Neither of them noticed the sharp shift in atmosphere until a low rumble of engines broke through the buzz of the summer heat. It started as a distant hum, then grew louder, faster, unmistakably different from the local traffic. Brenda Mullins, standing just outside the store, narrowed her eyes at the horizon. A black SUV came into view, then another, then 5 more, speeding in tight formation, lights off but purpose crystal clear. They screeched into the lot like a hammer falling from the sky. The gas station, once a stage for casual injustice, was now flooded with federal presence. Camilla didn't flinch. She just looked up, straightened her back, and waited. The first door swung open, and out stepped Colonel Mark Rains of Fort Redstone's QRF. His face unreadable, his steps precise. "General Hayes, are you hurt?" he asked as he approached. "Only minor abrasions," she replied calmly. "The greater damage was to their judgment." Benton's face went pale. Moore shifted backward instinctively. The soldiers didn't wait for explanations. They formed a protective perimeter around Camilla, released the cuffs, and helped her to her feet as if lifting a fallen flag. The message was clear. The United States Army had arrived, and it was not pleased. And for the first time that day, silence fell across Baker's quick stop. The mockery in the eyes of the crowd turned to disbelief. The smirks vanished. The same people who had watched passively before now looked away, unsure whether to feel shame or fear. Because this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a national incident, and the world had just started paying attention. The moment Major General Camilla Hayes was safely inside the lead SUV, the commanding officer of the Quick Reaction Force, Brigadier General David Lynn, stepped out into the oppressive southern heat, his posture rigid with controlled fury. He approached the Ashford officers, Lieutenant Benton and Officer Moore, without hesitation, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "You are interfering with an active federal operation," he stated, his finger pointing squarely at Benton's badge. "General Hayes was executing classified duties under Department of Defense authority. Every action you've taken here today will now fall under federal investigation." Benton opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. He could see the body cameras worn by the military team recording every second, and knew this was no longer a backroads misunderstanding. It was a career-ending spectacle. Moore glanced at his partner, visibly sweating, trying to look tough, but shrinking under the weight of his mistake. The soldiers said nothing more. They didn't need to. Their presence alone spoke volumes. Meanwhile, a bystander's shaky phone video had already hit the internet. The footage showed a black woman, calm, composed, being handcuffed against her car while clearly identifying herself as a U.S. Army general. There was no shouting, no resisting, no threats, just dignity met with disbelief. By nightfall, the video had amassed millions of views. It ran on the evening news, accompanied by outraged commentary from veterans groups, civil rights leaders, military officials, and journalists. Hashtags like #General Hayes and #Ashford incident began trending within hours. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. The notion that a decorated black female general could be so easily dismissed, so casually violated, stirred a deep, raw nerve across the nation. On Capitol Hill, members of the Armed Services Committee called for accountability. Statements poured in from retired generals, defense analysts, and advocacy organizations demanding immediate disciplinary action. The Department of Justice confirmed it had launched an official civil rights investigation into the Ashford Police Department. Local officials scrambled to do damage control, but it was too late. The story had become emblematic of something bigger than just one town, one station, or even one incident. It had become a symbol of how deep racial profiling ran and how it could strike even at the highest levels of public service. The Ashford PD issued a short, tone-deaf statement late that night claiming standard procedures were followed, which only poured gasoline on the fire. Within 24 hours, both Benton and Moore were placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Internal records, leaked by a whistleblower, revealed that Benton had previously received complaints for excessive force, none of which had ever resulted in formal discipline. Moore, despite his short time on the force, had already exhibited behavioral issues flagged during training. Their reputations unraveled in real time. Community members who had once turned a blind eye now demanded answers. But perhaps the most devastating consequence wasn't what they lost. It was the realization of what they never recognized. Because standing right in front of them had been a leader of American military power, a woman who had earned every star on her shoulder. And they had chosen ignorance over inquiry, assumption over fact. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was moral, cultural, and permanent. 3 days later, the gates of Fort Redstone were flanked by rows of cameras, boom mics, and news vans packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters lined up as if awaiting a historic moment, And in many ways, they were. Major General Camilla Hayes stepped up to the podium in her full-dress uniform, the late morning sun glinting off the ribbons and stars neatly aligned across her chest. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her gaze unwavering. There was no teleprompter, no carefully scripted statement from military public affairs. Just her voice, steady and resolute, slicing through the murmur of the crowd. "I am not here today to demand privilege," she began, "but to insist on recognition of basic human dignity. If a general can be handcuffed on the side of a road, with credentials in hand, doing her duty, then what happens to those without rank, without power, without a platform?" The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. She let the weight of her words settle, scanning the sea of faces, many of whom had watched the video, many of whom had never thought someone like her could be mistaken, ignored, or dismissed. But Camilla didn't speak from bitterness. There was no vengeance in her tone. She spoke with the calm precision of a leader who had seen war and who knew that sometimes the deepest wounds were inflicted not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when justice is denied. "This is not just about me," she continued. "This is about a culture that sees a uniform and still hesitates, that sees black skin and still questions authority. It's about a system that gave me medals, but couldn't see past my appearance when it mattered." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried clear and unshaken. Behind the cameras, civilians, veterans, military families, and students held signs that read, "We stand with General Hayes, and justice has no rank." Some wiped tears, others simply watched in awe. Camilla never wavered. "I do not stand here as a victim," she declared. "I stand here as a soldier. And a soldier does not retreat from injustice. We confront it, expose it, and demand better." She thanked her fellow officers who supported her, the legal teams pursuing the investigation, and the public who refused to look away. "This moment is not about punishment," she said. "It's about reckoning. It's about asking ourselves, what kind of country are we, if valor in service is not enough to earn basic respect in public?" As she concluded her statement, there was no dramatic pause, no performance, just the truth. A truth that had been handcuffed, pushed against a car, and reduced to silence, but had now taken center stage, wearing 4 stars and refusing to be ignored. The applause didn't erupt instantly. It grew slowly, building as if everyone there needed a second to process the power of what had just been said. And when it came, it wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Camilla stepped back from the podium, nodded once, and turned toward the base. Not faster, not slower, but with the same steady rhythm of someone who had walked through fire and come out carrying more than just her own name. She carried a message, and now the nation had no choice but to listen. 1 week after the incident, Major General Camilla Hayes stood before a congressional committee convened to address national concerns about police conduct and racial bias. The hearing room was packed. Lawmakers, journalists, military officials, and citizens from across the country, many of whom had followed her story from the moment her handcuffed image first appeared on their screens. Camilla didn't arrive flanked by an entourage or burdened by notes. She walked in alone, in uniform, and stood tall at the podium with the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be staged. When she spoke, her voice was calm but uncompromising. "We cannot expect change," she said, "if we continue to protect silence. And we cannot rebuild justice if we refuse to acknowledge the prejudice that exists within our own systems, sometimes even within ourselves." There was no posturing in her tone, no self-pity. She wasn't there to play politics. She was there to hold up a mirror to a nation that still struggled to see clearly. Her words rang out not only as testimony, but as a challenge, one that reached far beyond the walls of that chamber. The video of her appearance was clipped and shared across every major platform, racking up millions of views in days. And while the headlines continued, what lingered longer than any soundbite was the lesson she left behind. Discrimination doesn't always come in the form of violence. It often arrives in silence. It comes through a narrowed gaze, a whispered suspicion, a casual phone call that turns someone's existence into a threat simply because they don't look right. It doesn't need a badge or a baton. Sometimes all it needs is the benefit of the doubt withheld. And while the officers in Ashford may have worn the uniforms, The truth is, their actions reflected a culture that spans far beyond a single department. It's a culture that teaches us to fear what we don't understand, to judge before we ask, and to default to power instead of humanity. But the greater tragedy isn't in the act itself, it's in the silence of those who watch and say nothing. In every story like Camilla's, there are bystanders. Some record, some whisper, some look away. Yet every one of them carries the same choice: speak up or stay complicit. Change begins not with sweeping reforms or televised hearings, but with individual courage. The courage to ask questions, to challenge bias, to hold systems accountable even when it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes it doesn't take a movement. Sometimes it takes one voice, calm and unshaken, to bring the entire system to its knees. And if a four-star general must raise that voice just to be heard, we must ask ourselves, who's being silenced when the cameras aren't rolling? If you believe that dignity and justice should never be defined by the color of someone's skin or the insignia on their shoulder, then don't let this story fade into the scroll. Share it, talk about it, teach it, and subscribe to X Daily Stories, where we uncover the voices often buried, shine light on the truths many fear to speak, and give life to the stories that demand to be heard. Because real change starts not when we watch, but when we refuse to look away.